Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Bradley Thayer, founding member on the Committee of President-Danger China. He touches on the Taiwan issue, why it's significant not just militarily, but also from a civilian perspective, and the geopolitical implications going forward, and ways Beijing may subvert Taiwan. Let's dive in. Welcome, Bradley. Thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So recently, Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen spoke on CNN, and she confirmed the presence of U.S. troops in the country. And she also reiterated that she's confident that Biden, the U.S., will help Taiwan if China attacks. So what's your stance on that?
Well, it was a very interesting comment that President Tsai made, the Taiwanese president, acknowledging what had been suspected, that there were U.S. forces in Taiwan to assist the Taiwanese with training. She referenced Special Operations Forces and United States Marines, which are both logical forces to be there. And so that was a very important development. We can see, if you will, a trajectory where, with President Trump's remarks in 2019 stating that China knew what would happen if China attacked Taiwan, President Biden's comments of a week ago, where there was the explicit statement that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China were to attack it. So you can see a bit of a trajectory there that the U.S. policy of calculated ambiguity, which had sustained the United States and China and Taiwan throughout the 1990s and in the last and since then, is being eroded. And we should expect that the United States and Taiwan increasingly move towards what would be, in a de facto sense, in a practical sense, an alliance in all but in name.
And so a lot of these moves are seen as making Beijing even more aggressive. And some have been saying that if Beijing were to attack Taiwan, it wouldn't be so much a kinetic warfare, but more cyber. Even former State Secretary Condoleezza Rice made the suggestion that it would be through paramilitary means, subverting Taiwan from within. And then she gave the example of Russia taking over eastern Ukraine. So do you see that as an option, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly that's a danger that the former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice mentioned, that the mainland, that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, could employ hybrid warfare against Taiwan, that the Russians really events that the Russians demonstrated in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, as you mentioned, where there's a combination of measures taken, not militarily, not military steps originally, but relying on local populations to protest, relying on media and information operations to begin to blur the lines between peacetime or the status quo and a situation where there may be groups within Taiwan, just as there were within Ukraine, that would welcome an attack, at least purportedly. NATO worries about that with respect to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, that the Russians may employ hybrid warfare tactics, relying on support of the Russian members in those states. In Taiwan, where supporters of the mainland or neutral parties or individuals begin calling for unification. And that opens the door towards Chinese information operations to begin to generate, if you will, international support for the mainland's attack against Taiwan. So that's very dangerous. I think we need to recognize that there's a spectrum of steps that Beijing may take against Taipei, and hybrid, obviously an outright invasion, but smaller steps that could turn into an invasion, like former Secretary of State Rice mentioned, are a very great danger, and we need to be very careful to ensure that if Beijing were to try those measures, that they could be defeated.
And so you brought up hybrid warfare, but it sounds like this is harder to tell than, say, kinetic warfare, like an all-out war. It's a very kind of hidden way. So what are some ways of recognizing that that's happening?
Well, some ways that would be important to recognize would be if in a relatively short period of time you have a lot of calls within Taiwan, that actors within Taiwan really operating at the behest of Beijing. That might call for neutrality, that might call for unification, that might call for a variety of measures. Internationally, you could see perhaps Beijing would rely on international media, that would rely on other states in international politics, for example, states that are close like Pakistan, to Beijing to call for unification. So you could see in information operations, right? You could see the effort to generate, perhaps in the UN as well, support for not just unification, but rather rapid unification with the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. So those would be steps. We want to be pay very close attention to international media, and we want to pay very close attention to groups within the Republic of China as well as outside who might be making those types of appeals, because they would be acting as puppets, right? Beijing is the puppet master trying to coordinate that effort. You could see perhaps as well legal efforts to come into play, that Beijing may appeal to essentially aspects of the history or aspects of international law that would favor it. So those are all going to be measures within Beijing, or excuse me, within China, People's Republic of China. We could see, for example, protests, right? That Beijing is very good at mobilizing popular protests. So we could see, if you will, it would be astroturf, of course, it would be manufactured, but a purported groundswell of popular support for unification by force as well. So those would all be indicators, again, all done by the Russians in their activities against Crimea and against Ukraine. So we should anticipate those tactics.
And so recently, even with Taiwan in so many headlines, it seems for a lot of Americans, say at home, it seems like a very distant issue, not something close. But Taiwan, from a military perspective, is important because it's part of the first island chain, right? So if Taiwan falls, then it opens up the whole Pacific. But from a civilian point of view, why is the Taiwan issue such a big deal for maybe, say, the average Joe at home? How would it impact them?
Well, certainly, it's important, first of all, because it is a democracy. And so what we see in the clash between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China is a clash between a brutal dictatorship in the mainland and a democratic government, a free and democratic government in Taiwan, which is deserving of support. Traditionally an ally of the United States in the course of the Cold War. The Taiwanese fought with the United States in Vietnam and in other conflicts that the United States had in the course of the Cold War. And ties, if you will, still remain, and that legacy of support still remains. So Taiwan is, in microcosm, really the dispositive issue of the 21st century. Is totalitarianism going to win, or is democracy going to win? And so support, American support for Taiwan is very important for the sustenance of free and democratic governments in the 21st century. Additionally, we want to recognize that Taiwan is an alternative, that China does not have to be ruled by the thuggish Chinese Communist Party. Taiwan offers an alternative government, right? Taiwan demonstrates that China works as a democracy. And so, of course, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, hate it, and they want to get rid of it because they recognize that it's a rival. It's an alternative and a very viable one. So we need to recognize that Americans need to recognize that we would hold out hope that someday that Taiwan would be the future government of China, and that at some point the CCP will fall and it will be replaced by a democratic government. And Taiwan has shown us how that can function within the confines of Chinese culture.
And so also right now we have the whole supply chain crisis. And part of that is like, say, chips or semiconductors, which go from everything from spaceships to our cell phones. And so Taiwan is a huge manufacturer of that. So how would, say, Taiwan getting involved in a war impact, say, the chip industry? And how would that impact our lives?
It would be disastrous. And so what we're seeing is just the precursor of what may be, were there to be a war over Taiwan and Taiwanese chip production be significantly damaged or destroyed, we could see that the supply chain crisis that we now face would be orders of magnitude worse as a consequence of it. So we need to ensure that for strategic reasons also, chip production, as well as Taiwan's geographical location, as well as Taiwan's role within the region and internationally, Taiwan stays independent. So the fact that Taiwan is one of the world's major chip producers is also a major reason why we have to ensure that it is independent. It does not fall within the grasp of the Chinese Communist Party. Were it to do so, of course, the Chinese Communist Party would would ensure that chips did not flow to the West, did not flow to the United States. So it would be a disastrous development, and one that would affect all Americans immediately and directly in a way that the supply chain crisis, however bad it is, of course, and it is a very difficult situation for so many Americans, would be much, much worse.
And so President Biden has recently reiterated his commitment to helping to defend Taiwan in the case of a war. And Australia's defense minister has also said Australia would then also join the U.S. in defending. And even now we have New Zealand also opting to join the AUKUS deal. Not with the nuclear submarines, but still for the more presence in the Indo-Pacific. But now I think there's like a question about the EU. I know some EU lawmakers are set to visit Taiwan next week, but overall, how do you see the EU as playing in? Are they going to stand with Taiwan, or what's your take on that?
Well, we would hope so. Again, the dispositive question of this century is totalitarianism going to be viable? Are we going to live under totalitarian government? Will that be able to set the rules, the norms, the principles of international politics? Or will the Western liberal international order survive? And so the EU is going to have to pick a side. They're either going to have to come down and to on China's side, and there's that economic argument, Chinese investment penetration of EU societies, political penetration of EU societies, or they're going to have to come down on the standpoint of their values, their principles, democratic, liberal values and principles that the EU possesses. We would hope they will come down on the latter side, that with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, with New Zealand, the United States, and India, right, this coterie, this grouping of democracies that quite easily and logically the EU can plug into and should fit into, absolutely, rather than siding with a regime that supports Muslim concentration camps, which grossly abuses human rights of their Muslim citizens, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, or Uyghurs, obviously, notably the Tibetan people. Do we want that society? Do we want the Chinese Communist Party setting the rules for the 21st century? I think quite reasonably, the EU is going to say, no, we don't. And that it's important to stand with Taiwan, even though it's in Asia, right, traditionally, obviously, outside the purview of the European Union. The principles are universal, and the principles are fundamental, and the EU should come along. We have seen progress with Britain's obviously cooperation, but French and German cooperation as well. So there are glimmerings of hope in terms of the recognition that the EU is coming down on the right side in support for Taiwan, despite some hesitancy and despite still some obstacles that remain.
So it almost sounds like it comes down to a money versus morals question. And some experts have been saying the West kind of created the Communist Party into what it is by helping them join the World Trade Organization and funneling all this money in. And a lot of experts have been saying that, say, doing business with China is kind of like an 8-lane highway, and if only one country pulls out, there's still 7 lanes left. It doesn't really do any damage. So it almost seems like there needs to be a coordinated effort. But in the current standing of things, how do you see that as playing out?
Well, I think that's that's an excellent comparison. What we need to recognize that the more coordinated it is, obviously, the more effective we will be able to put pressure on the Chinese Communist Party to bring about, ideally, change and ideally essentially have it removed from power and to have democracy on mainland China. So we are seeing it's difficult, of course, historically in international politics to coordinate alliances. States have multiple interests, and you're exactly right. There's the pocketbook, right? There's the wallet, the money that they're getting from China, but also the values, the principles, and the recognition that if China does indeed become dominant, it's going to be a very different world for individuals in the West and individuals globally. So the recognition of building that type of coalition is a difficult one, but we're seeing steps in the Quad, that is India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. AUKUS is a very important development for showing that Britain now is making a commitment. We would hope that in time, France and Germany, two EU powers with substantial military might, would be able to again participate in naval exercises as they have done to a very modest degree, but we would hope that that would expand. Fundamentally, however, as I mentioned, the EU is going to have to make a choice. Are you going to ally with the brutality of the Chinese Communist Party, or are you going to work to sustain the liberal international order that has been indeed so successful, and you're exactly right, is in fact responsible for the sustenance of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1990s, and obviously after they entered the WTO in 2001, which has made possible their tremendous growth and has made possible the CCP to be able to remain in power despite the interests of the Chinese people.
And so a lot of these sound like, say, high-level diplomatic talks among politicians and high-level officials. But is there anything, say, the average Joe at home could do to kind of try and help?
Well, certainly there are steps that you could take. First of all, ensure that you're aware really of the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think informing yourself about that by reading media that call attention to it, like Epoch Times, and other media that are going to recognize the brutality of this regime, I think that's very important, right? The recognition that the app designers, the creators, are required to provide that information to the CCP, ultimately, to the Chinese government, and ultimately, thus, of course, to the Chinese Communist Party. So being aware that staying away from Huawei or other type of IT equipment, being aware of the apps that you download on your phone are also an important step. And then thirdly, thinking about, as American citizens should do and global citizens should do, what type of future do we want to have? Do we want to have a future where it resembles what we've enjoyed in the post-Cold War period, where liberalism and freedom and democracy, rights of minorities, rights of women are advanced, or do we want to go back to a totalitarian, a very dark future for international politics that will reward a small number of individuals at the top, but that would come at a tremendous cost for everyone else? And so all the world citizens need to reflect on that, and that is, do we want to sustain what we have despite its problems and the difficulties that we have, or do we want to have a political situation, an economic situation, and a moral situation which is infinitely worse? for a global population. All the world's citizens can reflect on that and come to their own conclusions. I believe if they educate themselves about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, they'll recognize that what we have needs to be sustained. The Chinese Communist Party has to be defeated, and they need to stand with Taiwan and support it against the depredations coming from the Chinese Communist Party.
And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I would simply like to add as well that having this venue is extremely important. We need to be able to call attention to the abuses of the Chinese Communist Party. Too often, for whatever reason, whether it's a financial reason or whether it is a personal reason or whether it is the penetration of the CCP, too often global media are shying away from the hard and difficult, facing the difficult situation that is the CCP and their control over the Chinese people and the threat that they pose to international stability. So having obviously Epoch Times and having media that can begin to question, that can begin to fight against perhaps economic interests that they may possess, to stand with freedom in the future is absolutely essential. So I greatly commend your work on this and calling attention to it, despite the reaction and the vitriol directed at Epoch Times and other media focusing on this very important issue. So I would add that that's absolutely essential to have. Too many of the media have been co-opted, and too few are able to accurately call attention to the abuses, human rights abuses and other abuses essentially generated by the Communist Party of China.
Well, Bradley, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with Bradley Thayer. Thanks for watching and see you next time.